and Legislative and Policy Committees. I hope I don't have to say that too many times. I'd like to note that, yes, fast. We're starting the meeting at 6:10 p.m. We are live streaming this via NVTC's YouTube account, and staff have confirmed that we have a quorum. We need to check in. Do we need to let anybody else in, or we're good? All right. So we do have one commissioner, non-committee member who has requested electronic participation. Potentially Delegate Sickles is participating virtually from Alexandria as he has a conflict. Can I have a motion to approve Delegate Sickles' request to participate remotely?
So moved.
Is there a second? Thank you. First from Commissioner Garvey, second from Commissioner DeFerranti.
Both from on.
Oh, any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Motion passes. We have a robust discussion ahead of us, but before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to MVTC WMATA Committee Chair Walter Alcorn for a couple of brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Kanik. I'm glad this is another opportunity to bring the two committees together. We've got several big transit funding and policy issues facing us as committees and as MVTC and for all of Northern Virginia. So when we met in October as a committee, we began talking about significant work that we're doing with developing long-term dedicated funding for WMATA and other public transit agencies across our region. So since that time, the General Assembly passed Senate Joint Resolution 28, thank you, Senator Evan, which will build upon our work from the Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group. Earlier this week, the Commonwealth passed a budget that included additional funding for WMATA to help close the operating budget gap for the next 2 years. Thank you also, Senator Evan and others. Tonight, we can be very proud of the progress we've made, and we really have, I think, laid the foundation for this next round of work where we're going to be looking at long-term funding for public transit. So, Kanik, I'll pass it back over to you for the next agenda item.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Alcorn. So we have one administrative item on our agenda, and it is the approval of our two meeting summaries. Do any Legislative and Policy Committee members have any changes or comments on the October 19th committee meeting summary?
I move approval?
I don't think we actually have to do any.
Yeah. Make sure it's correct.
So seeing no corrections or amendments, I will pass it back to Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you, Kanik. Do any WMATA committee members have any changes to the February 29th WMATA committee meeting summary? Any changes? Okay, then those will be accepted. So, Kanik, back to you.
So, I would like our legislative liaison, Amy Perone-Seibert, to provide a quick update on the General Assembly activities from this week. She's over here.
I was. Kate made me move closer to the microphone. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to give an update. Obviously, the General Assembly ended in March, and then again in May. So we had a meeting, obviously, of the General Assembly on Monday, where we approved the budget and the governor signed it as well. Preliminarily, it still takes effect on July 1st, but good news to report, obviously, is that we got all the Metro funding that we asked for, as well as the language that was in the budget that passed the General Assembly. So not the language that the governor had suggested in his amendments. And we are very grateful for that. And obviously, huge thank you to all of our Northern Virginia legislators who advocated for that and made it such a huge priority this year. We would definitely not be here without all those folks. And Senator Evan being one of them, obviously, Delegate Sickles, who was hugely helpful in making this a priority of the Northern Virginia delegation and continued to do so throughout the entire negotiation process. Senator Boysko as well. And obviously a big thank you to Senator Lucas and Delegate Torian for keeping it in there and really fighting for it during the negotiations with the governor, which was a huge big deal. So we're really grateful for that. Obviously, the money is going to be a huge help. What we did get was $60.2 million in the first year and $84.5 in the second. Preliminarily, that 60.2, the extra $500,000 that's in there, because we had asked for 59.7, that was a new number that Metro had given us because they were able to make additional savings since the General Assembly ended. 65 originally went down to 59.7. The preliminary conversations is that is money that is supposed to be allocated for a consultant of some type. We are working with the House Appropriations staff and the Senate Finance Committee staff to kind of find out what their intentions were and how we're going to work on like where that goes and how that gets allocated, because the money typically that we get for that goes to WMATA goes through DRPT to MBTC to be allocated. That money obviously says it's there, so we're trying to figure out how to make all that work. So there's a lot of conversations with the administration as well as the money committee staff to figure out kind of what the thinking was behind all that and how we can make sure that that is allocated appropriately and correctly according to the code. So obviously it also suspended the 3% cap, which is a big deal. That was a big piece that obviously we couldn't even pay our bill if that didn't get suspended, which was a concern that we had when there were some changes that were made. So we wanted to make sure that that piece was in there, and that remains in there as well. And so we are, I think when we met in October, this was not necessarily the outcome we expected. So this was, we had a lot of work went into that. And I think all my colleagues around the table, obviously Greg and Dave Albo, who was his lobbyist, that helped quite a bit. All the MBTC jurisdictions liaisons were hugely helpful. We met all the way during session in the cafeteria and talked quite a bit about what we're going to do. So without that team, we wouldn't have gotten there. So thanks to everybody for that. Happy to answer any questions.
Also, thank you. I mean, it's, passing it around to everybody else, you got to take your share of credit.
happy to help. Happy to help. So you're welcome. Okay.
There's so much drama, so much back and forth. And then all of a sudden it just went, boop. That all due to you?
Yes, all of it. I take full credit for everybody deciding to like one another. I have no explanation for how that happened. It's just welcome to the Virginia General Assembly, where people can be enemies one day and friends the next. So we are grateful that they were friends. Yeah.
Is a component of it that Senator Lucas and Senator Serval were on the same page? And I didn't know that.
Let's not even get into that.
Sure.
Ms. Matthijs, unless there's any other questions.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I mean, I absolutely, Amy and Greg and others, like the team was really big on this one. So it's not often that we get to sort of celebrate, and I'm sure we really have celebrated, but this is kind of a big deal. So I think that I'm really glad this turned out. We're going to talk a little bit more in granularity. Andrew's going to go a little bit more granularity about SJ 28. And sort of how there's a number of different things moving together, and we'll dive into those. At this time, we're still waiting for some appointments to SJ 28. We've not received the House appointments. So we do know from the Senate, Senator Evans, Senator Boysko, Senator Serval, and Supervisor Alcorn have been appointed to serve on the subcommittee for SJ 28, but we still are waiting the House appointments. So that's something that I hope we're going to hear soon. What we would have loved to have at this meeting when we scheduled was actually like the game plan. That game plan has not been drawn up when it comes to meetings and how those things are working together. But we're already in close communication with appropriations and Senate Finance staff for the rollout. So keep watching this space. And again, in a minute, we're going to talk about how all of this stuff works together. And in fact, actually, I may be able to, I guess we can pause on the legislative stuff, and then I was going to give a little bit of overview on the WMATA COG effort that launched 2 weeks ago. Great. So just moving on the slides, we have, I know that several of you were around the table, and we also had Clark Mercer come and speak to it but 2 weeks ago, if I do my math, or was that just last week? I'm not quite sure. But specifically about the DMV Moves initiative that is going on with being led by WMATA and COG, but it really is intended to involve all of our jurisdictions, all of your city and county managers, our regional staff. And so we've got a little bit of background. I mean, again, this is a COG effort that we have a role in, but it is very much theirs. The idea being is that is having DC, Maryland, and Virginia come together to create a vision for what public transit should be looking like, and then really identifying what are those needs to make that moving towards an ask among the 3 large jurisdictions. Again, there's a lot of stuff happening in the space. I did just check with Mr. Mercer a little bit earlier today. There's a lot of scheduling that's still in the process of happening. We do know on June 10th, on Monday, June 10th, there will be the kickoff meeting of the regional task force. And that body is made up of appointed and elected officials from DC, Maryland, Virginia, WMATA, and the federal government. For the general Virginia area, Mr. Smedberg is actually the task force co-chair. We also have Jessica Hay, Phyllis Randall, Michael Sargent, who's the Deputy Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth. Delegate Sickles and Senator Sorrell are appointed to that. I know there's been other conversations about that, but that's the task force. But then there's a government advisory group. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Real fast.
Yeah.
You get us the names for the other folks from the other jurisdictions from DC and Maryland.
I can.
If you.
Yeah, we can just get that circulated. Absolutely. See, I walk with this everywhere. This was the handout that was provided at that meeting. So happy to share that. We can follow up and scan this and share this to get out.
After the meeting.
But when it comes to the role of your jurisdiction staff and NBTC staff, there's a government partner advisory group that's going to be made up of the chief administrative officers of all the COG member governments, local and state transit agencies, us, the authority, the airports authority, and DRPT. So that in my conversations, and I think was shared by Clark at our board meeting, that's sort of rolling up the sleeves and getting down into the details. We're again waiting for when those meetings are going to be scheduled. My understanding it is forthcoming when those are going to get scheduled. There is also a stakeholder group that is going to be, the government partner advisory group is going to be chaired by Brian Hill, who is the county executive for Fairfax County. And then there is a stakeholder group called the Community Partners Advisory Group, which is going to be chaired by Jack McDougall from the Greater Washington Board of Trade. And I know that group is still being formulated. There's a lot of conversation of there was a published list, but my understanding that is not the list. There may be a lot more organizations that were not initially identified. So again, that's another group that will be working on this. So I do definitely defer to COG on sort of how this rolls out. We're still waiting a little bit more details. Obviously, Clark came to the commission meeting just a couple of weeks ago, but we do anticipate over the summer and into the fall a lot of activities going on with this space. You've got a graph and a little bit about how we want these to fit together. I'm not going to get into that, but we just did want to, again, we've talked a little bit about SJ28 and we'll talk a little bit more. We talked about this COG work. All of this stuff is not happening in a vacuum. And so it's very much all aligned with, as you move into agenda item 4, which is really the bigger picture about a long-term sustainable dedicated funding for transit. Is that good?
Yes,
Right. That okay. So I guess we're going to circle back or see if there's questions. I'm already ruining the order. So sorry, guys.
Okay, so we are now on item number 4. Is that correct? Okay, great. That's good because I do have a question about the DMP moves, but I'm going to wait until we go through that. So do any committee have any questions? When is the appropriate time? That last slide. Would this be the appropriate time?
DMV move side.
Yeah, I mean,
Let's just dive into it because there's a pretty, you could go back to the previous slide. Item number 3, in that nice little graphic at the bottom of step 3 of 4, funding scenarios and tools. I'm just, it'd be nice to confirm, is the assumption going into the DMV moves effort that the 3 jurisdictions may, and I would say probably will, develop their own funding sources, or is that going to be a single unified regional model, which at this point there is no such authority to tax uniformly regionally? But has that been discussed
That has not been discussed. I think that's a worthwhile conversation to be had.
Okay.
Um,
I mean, I'll just, throw out there, I think from our perspective in Northern Virginia, I'm not saying this is the right answer, but let's just say we decided a data center tax, made all the sense in the world to us.
I'd be all for that.
Again, just throwing out there. But, if Maryland and DC had no data centers, obviously that would not be a balanced regional approach. So just use that as an example. So is there any sense when they might sort of get past that assumption?
So that, we are waiting for additional information. As I said, there's going to be a task force kickoff on Monday, June 10th. But my sense is that's probably the conversations that end up happening among the chief administrative officers, this government group. And that meeting, the first meeting of that has not been scheduled, so we don't necessarily know the scope and the timeline. But those are questions that I know, just based upon our work here with all of you, are going to be very important questions to have raised.
Great. Yes,
Yeah.
Libby.
Sort of devil's advocate in a way.
Yeah.
How is it handled? There are other regional systems where at least they have two regions, right? Do they sometimes handle it with a regional sales taxi thing? And it's the other thing we sort of talked about, is that what they'll?
Yeah, so most of them are in one state. The example with two would be St. Louis.
I thought, yeah.
And from the research we did on that, there is a sales tax. I think you can call it regional, but there's a lot of nuance and definition about what that means, right? So from what we found when we looked at it is there's actually a sales tax on the Missouri side that Missouri institutes, and it varies by city or county. So it's not the same rate. And then there's also a sales tax on the Illinois county side, Illinois levies, and it also varies in rate. So that's how they handle it. And then both of those kind of go into the sort of St. Louis compact, of which the regional transit is one piece, how they do it. So that's just one example.
And good point, Wada, because I think this is like one of the key issues. Right? Hope they talk to all of us when they decide what they think they want to recommend.
Certainly, when it comes to approving any sort of new revenue authority, that has to go to the three jurisdictions. I mean, there's no other structure.
I think so.
Yeah, so it would have to work, I would think. Okay, thank you. Any other questions on slide 6 or anything else in item 3?
Thanks for diving into the toughest thing first.
Okay, you're welcome. Let's go to item number 4. All right, slide 7. Here we are. So let's hear from staff on the 3 related efforts we started talking a little bit about these. But let's hear more about 3 related long-term sustainable funding initiatives. So there are going to be a lot of slides. And can I just say from the get-go, I love this slide. This is
Is it
really
the old font too that you like? Is that like?
I have a little bit of an issue.
Typewritten, isn't it?
Really old.
Typewriter.
Hey,
And there's a WMATA version of these, but I picked a few for our audience. So,
all right, take it away.
yeah, absolutely. So the issue of dedicated funding for Metro certainly is not a new discussion. I've selected some calls for dedicated funding for various reports going back to the 70s. So on the top left, there was a 1979 report where the GAO notes that solving the continued financial crisis by earmarking, guaranteeing tax revenue for the system is critical for the build out of the system. It notes that the GIO report notes that Metro studied this and put out a couple possibilities to meet this criteria: payroll tax, sales tax, an income tax surcharge, and a 1 cent or a gas tax. So I think a lot of these have been studied for decades. The next to highlight is a 1997 Blue Ribbon Panel report on bus in the region. So that sounds familiar. That acknowledges the challenges of the current funding model, and it notes that transit is an annual competition for funding in the local jurisdictions. competing against other state and local responsibilities for shrinking general fund dollars, leading to Metro not being able to establish budget priorities and anticipate the results of each jurisdiction's budget process, given the timing issue. So again, that sounds eerily familiar after the last year. And then the Brookings report in 2005 continues this. I'm not even going to go into it. It just sort of continues to study it and look at the call. And then again, as a reminder, our last year's annual report on Metro also makes this recommendation for both capital and operating. Next slide. Okay, so this is the big graphic that Kate mentioned. Before we get to the individual presentations that we have coming, I do want to try to put these various efforts in context. And so this is how NBTC staff are thinking about all of the various interrelated pieces here. So starting in the light green, that's the NBTC authored efforts and or studies that have either been completed or are currently ongoing. So the first is that 2023 annual report we made various, which the commission approved in December. We made a number of funding that are covered later in the presentation. The Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group, which the commission accepted the report for that in April, so it was very, very recent. That provides 10 revenue estimates in the NBTC district and 4 statewide revenue estimates, and also a revenue structure recommendation to direct funding to NBTC to allocate to all transit agencies operating in the district. Got more information on that in 3 slides if you want to look. I'm happy to answer questions. We have present on these before. High level. And then lastly, the regional bus analysis that we're conducting aims to provide a regional context and analysis of existing and planned bus services in Northern Virginia. And as part of that effort, it's assembling the individual transit development plans for each of our local bus providers. And Xavier is going to talk about that soon. So all of this information helps to provide foundational inputs into the SJ28 Joint Subcommittee on Northern Virginia Public Transit. That's the dark green box we mentioned previously. That is an effort of the Virginia General Assembly. So this group will provide, and I'll talk a little bit more about the group. In the context of the studies, this group will provide revenue estimates for both MBTC and PRTC districts, and also aims to provide a long-term funding solution for all transit. Maryland has a similar effort purple there that's been ongoing since last year. It's the Commission on Transportation. It actually has a lot of objectives because it's addressing more than funding, but in just the funding piece, what's relevant to our conversation is that they do intend to make recommendations on the funding sources and the structure of their transportation trust fund, and that's currently at least how Maryland thinks. And they also are looking at options for sustainable long-term transportation. It's our hope that these various processes feed into each other and are able to integrate sort of the Maryland and Virginia specific work so that with the larger COG Metro Board team moves process so that we can have these things work in a coordinated fashion across the region. Next slide.
Andrew, before we,
Yeah,
let me go back to last. I guess there's no thing for DC right now.
Yeah, so I have a tiny.
Okay, all right, sorry.
It basically says there isn't really, so the way we're looking at it, at least right now, there's not really a there's not a process per se, because there doesn't kind of have to be. We know that DC is engaged in this, is very interested. We know that when the mayor proposed her budget, I think there was a piece of the sales tax increase was sort of thought of as a prelude to this conversation. But you know, they don't have to do the level of convening, I think, that or like structure that.
Yeah, they get 5 seats, which is good.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I kind of want to.
Good point.
But I should know this. Maryland, what's the issue there? I mean, like, we're all like, you know, struggling with how much we have to pay. Virginia doesn't pay. And I just sort of said, well, Maryland, they ain't got to worry, the state just puts the money in. Obviously, they do have some ways. I mean, are they concerned about how it's working out for them?
So I would say for them, it is a revenue shortage. So they have had a pretty significant gap. I think they did some short-term moves, but long-term, I think basically this would have been earlier for them if not for the pandemic. So COVID aid plugged the hole, and this is the year that they had a pretty sizable gap in their statewide trust fund, and that affects everything. It affects Metro, it affects Baltimore.
And it's not just transit, it's all transit.
It's all transportation. Yeah.
And Metro's gobbling it up and they're not, okay. So they do need to fix it too.
And so that's why last year they stood up that statewide commission. I think they did some interim recommendations, which we're happy to send a link to.
I vaguely
Yeah.
remember that.
Yep.
Sorry, any other questions before we move on? Okay, thank you for the tolerating the interruption.
So I think what I'll do now is cover a quick overview of SJ 28, as Kate mentioned it, and we have talked about it at prior committee and commission meetings, but happy to take more detailed questions. This was authored by Senator Evan. It will study long-term sustainable dedicated operating and capital funding for all transit agencies in the 2 districts, and also look at cost containment controls only for WMATA. And that is, in the big picture, this is to as I said, ensure that all transit agencies in the 2 districts have single fund. So that does include our local agencies, OmniRide, Veer. And as mentioned on the previous slide, our technical and policy work is an important input in this effort. Next slide. The effort has 2 groups. There's a subcommittee appointed by the House and the Senate that can make recommendations. As of this time, as Kate mentioned, the Senate made their appointments, so those are shown on the screen. Of note, Commissioners Evan and Alcorn are on this group. NVTC is also on the technical work group. I'll provide jurisdictions once we know more about how this process will move forward. Next slide. And lastly, this effort will be managed by Senate staff with support from the Division of Legislative Services. And in addition to 2 NVTC authored reports, the subcommittee is tasked with incorporating additional inputs that are shown on the slide. And the subcommittee will complete its meetings for the first year, which is this year, 3024, and second year by November 30, 2025. So I will stop there for any, turn back to the chair for any questions. We're happy to go into more detail from what we know, but this is high level.
Yes, Mr. Different.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you look at the slide on DMV moves, I'm just sort of trying to piece it together because we've had some conversations about the compact jurisdictions and I don't know the compact quite as well, except that they're sort of ranging between 28, 29, 34% or something like that. But I've jumped in my mind always to the funding and not the analysis of how much funding that we need. And given that we have, in all likelihood, 2 years, there's nearly 0 chance that we will have anything happen next year as far as legislative action. That the thinking has to come over the next bit. But I'm just wondering, thinking about the tectonics of, like, you mentioned a sales tax, regional sales tax, and like how many rail and bus services are in each jurisdiction. Has there been any thought, I guess, technically, maybe it's staff, Kate and Andrew, like to first trying to really focus SJ 28 or DMV moves on like understanding more about how much transit we need, like before we jump to the other stuff, because we have a lot of time to study and it means a different approach. Like if we go straight to the funding thing, then, we all have our jurisdictions where we, regional sales tax is for sure what Arlington might want and not for sure what Fairfax might want. So I wonder if is there on both fronts, can we focus on the compact or like understanding, I guess, number 2 on the DMV moves before we get to the funding, because the funding is going to be legislative and we're all going to have perspectives and I just don't know.
So in fact, we're actually getting a preview of some of the work, the deep dive work, and Xavier's going to cover it, which is actually what we're doing on behalf of all of our bus systems right now.
Yeah.
To identify what do those systems look like. So Xavier's going to give us an overview of what we're seeing on the buses. VRE, I know, is working on their strategic plan, their system plan. That's going on. WMATA, for example, is doing their better bus network. So there actually are parallel. What does transit look like? And so that's the pieces that we have here at NVTC Specifically, Xavier is going to talk about the bus piece. WMATA is working into their things in VRA. So we actually, I think we are approaching analytically from that place. I think probably it will be looking to the task force to slow down and wait for what's the vision before we figure out what. Does that make sense?
It all does. I mean, I would
Yeah.
say that, others at this table may already know the rail component of it. It's super important to Falls Church in Alexandria and Arlington, and I guess Alexandria as well. But is there a way to do a little analysis that gets us a sense of the rail per person and the rail relative service? So a thought that occurred to me is like, if you put in 4 more stations, then the rail share pay of a locality might feel a lot different than if you don't. And so,
Okay.
I mean, that analysis might already be done, but like, if we're doing the bus thing, I'm not trying to steal the
Right.
good doctor's stuff, but does it already exist, the rail?
Well, I think WMATA is probably the key lead for that, and I don't know if Greg, in terms of the scope, I mean, the DMV moves, I anticipate there's a conversation about what does Metro look like as a part of that conversation.
So the question is specifically on the rail side, and what's been done?
Yeah, let me try to reframe it
Sure.
because I think what we're hearing is on the bus side, I think we've got sort of the longer term need, at least if not identified, there's a process.
Studied, yeah.
Right, to be studied, and we're gonna get some numbers. And actually, when I got briefed on WMATA Better Bus, I asked specifically for that, because I said, how much would this cost? On rail, is there anything equivalent? I know the BOS study was out there, but
We did do a big presentation last Thursday to the board about the fleet plan. So that got into what are the needs for rail cars in the future? What's the plan for the road of the 8,000 series? So there was a big presentation that was done last week on that. So that gets into future needs, current needs, all that. So that's out there.
I believe that it's probably there, and I'm perhaps asking it inartfully, but we have pretty clearly, I think, the number of rail stations per capita in Arlington. So there's what the infrastructure is, and then there's what the level of service or what goes into determining what should be there. And I'm happy to follow up afterwards or try to articulate it more clearly, but it just occurred to me that, when we're thinking about the compact, we ought to know, like, how relatively are we trying to provide rail service? And I'm sure it's somewhere, or I'm sure it could be done, but I didn't think that it was already done. So
I think, didn't Randy, when it was somewhere else, I heard him talk about wanting to sort of envision how it really should just all work, and that we're supposed to your point, which is really a good one. You want to figure out what do you want to have first, and then back up from that. And I think that's sort of what they're.
My sense that's the intent of the DMV moves part to it. We do have a sense, obviously, with the FY25 budget that was passed, there is a vision for what that service is buying you. So what is that budget buying in terms of service, headways, all that kind of stuff. And so, but I think that that's definitely something we can find out a little bit more information, because I think all of this there's a holistic need to look at rail, at bus, at everything sort of when we create this vision. But the experts on that will be the Metro folks.
I'm not saying it's a burning, and I'm not trying to send you scurrying. I'm just trying to understand that component. I think it could be helpful because, and for me, probably, others at the table have probably reread the formula associated with the compact, but that is a baseline that eventually not just the experts like you guys, but more of me and perhaps all the other elected officials at the room know the compact formula, but I do not off the top. And
Well, if I can add to that, there's a critical piece here. The rail and bus formulas for Metro and paratransit as well, they're actually not in the compact, they're board approved. So the board is actually anticipating looking at both of them this summer. And potentially with changes sort of integrated into the fall with a year one bus network. So it's a lot of work. But so those are, I think, absolutely going to be things that are on the table and discussed both here and in the region this summer.
Okay.
I think the way we're thinking about it at staff level, I think maybe if I can go back to last summer when we did the working group, we started looking at, okay, here's the $750 million operating gap. Let's solve reduce share. That's what we're looking for. Right? When we landed in April, after sort of the journey that we've all been on, is okay, we need to lay out some options, but there needs to be a bigger conversation about what we're solving for. And that's a conversation that includes bus, metro, rail, at points that were raised. Yes, it's closed the gap, but what else are we doing? Kind of thing. And then there's the local agency side and VRE. And they kind of have their versions of that as well, just to different scales. So I'm not sure exactly which process we'll put that all together, but I know that's how we're thinking about it and trying to help kind of move the conversation forward.
Supervisor Walker.
Thank you. This maybe would have been more appropriate comment for we're on slide 3B, just talking about DMV moves, but I think it's relevant to saying what you're saying. I do have a little bit of a concern about the process of crafting a vision for the transit network we would like, seemingly completely unconstrained from the financial and fiscal realities. And there's value in that kind of planning, absolutely. At VRE, we're about to produce a long-range system plan that is not financially constrained. You want to do that planning. I'm skeptical that that's going to be the right approach here. I don't know how valuable that will be for us to say, here is the transit network that we would love to have throughout the DMV. Set aside costs, pretend it doesn't, costs don't matter. And then after that, then we'll sit down and talk about funding and how to fund it. Personally, I think it would be more effective if you develop maybe tiered plans within the confines of some kind of fiscal reality, whether that's, sales taxes of 0.5 cent and 1 cent, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, or whatever it is, to see, because, even with dedicated revenue, there still will be limited revenue, right? Even systems that have dedicated revenue sources have the same battles that we have every year. And the people running the system will say they don't have enough money, they don't have enough predictability. Maybe over the course of DMV moves, I'll try to make that argument, but I'm concerned about us developing this kind of gold-plated regional plan of what transit could be, not think about the cost, and then put it down on paper and realize it's going to cost far more than a dedicated revenue source could fund. I don't know what purpose that serves.
And just to build on that a little bit, I think it's not only a need to constrain in terms of revenue and financial side, but also land use reality. I don't think, in Fairfax County, I don't think we're going to build an advanced transit system for Clifton, for example. So I think this is part of the discussion, or at least the understanding. One thing I would, this brings up to me, I think it's important, if there could be a universe that goes across the jurisdictions, that could be helpful. Because I know we're talking rail, I know we're talking bus, including local service, but paratransit is part of, Metro Access is part of WMATA. Is, or so we also looking at local paratransit systems? I don't know, maybe.
I think
So we probably need to identify what is the universe of what does transit mean for the purposes of this analysis? That would be helpful.
So while we're on the subject, I made the assumption, which might be wrong. I think there's some memberships that they don't even have metro, they don't have metro stop. There's some, and I think the point was they wanted buy-in. So to your point about the goal, it feels to me like what thinking has been so far is to come up with really a big region-wide plan where we don't even go yet, but we will, to get buy-in. And that, which is getting maybe beyond what might be wise, I don't know, but that was my feeling about where they were going. Am I off base?
I think there's a lot of information that we're still waiting to hear from. And so it's getting sort of formalized. As I said, meetings haven't been set yet. We do have at the government leader task force level I think is going to be a very important part, especially for our jurisdictions, because we do have chief administrative officers and the transit system folks from every single one of your jurisdictions. I think that's where there's a focus on those who have and are paying for transit services, sitting at that work, and that's the group where recommendations are going to be brought forward. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to roll up your sleeves and dive into questions before they even get to the task force level. But this is not our initiative. We're going to be doing everything we can to support it on behalf of NBTC.
It's really gonna be interesting. I mean, there's sort of bifurcated, because you've got us, we want to figure out how to fund it. This is we're thinking about this for a long time. And then you've got way out Carroll County, somebody like, say what? And then what do you want to do? What? And so that it's totally different levels of interest and background, and bringing it all together. It's gonna be very interesting.
If I could, I'm sorry. Delegate Sickles actually has been able to join. We couldn't see him, but I want to let you know he's actually going to be one of the task force members as well. So I just want to let you know that he's joined the meeting.
Mr. Gary.
Thank you, Mr. I just wanted to second some of your comments around paratransit. I had brought this up a couple of years ago when I was chairing the Access for All Committee at TPB, and I think concurrently chair here at MVTC. It is not an easy conversation, but I think it is definitely one that merits our attention for sure, especially as a region.
It's not cheap.
No, well, we find out what we provide is less expensive and works better.
Okay.
Yep. Other comments?
I think we shouldn't dwell, or shouldn't leave the conversation without articulating, because I have had a number of conversations, as has Libby, and definitely the 5 appointed, mindful of the need for small, but the 5 appointed, all great. Alexandria, Arlington, Falls Church, you guys in Fairfax might appreciate that we would have loved to have added to that shindig. And I don't think it's a crisis that we can't work through, but I do want to at least say that out loud so that it's an invitation, because I haven't talked with Senator Evan or with you, Kanik, or, and, we will work forward, but you can imagine that, that's a little tricky. If that had happened in Fairfax, there would have been some interesting conversations that would have occurred, as you know. And so if there's ways to move forward constructively there, happy to have individual conversations that are appropriate under open meetings. But I feel like we shouldn't leave the conversation without saying that out loud. I have talked with the mayor, but I haven't had a chance. And Kanik, I know that you, and I don't know, Libby, if you want to add to that, but.
I've said a lot over time. I think I'll stop at the moment, so thank you.
Well,
I'm not trying to dwell, but I am trying to say out loud.
No, it absolutely, it needs to be out there. It's kind of
go
out.
ahead, please.
And I won't belabor the point, but it is not lost on us in Alexandria as well that there is no inside the Beltway jurisdiction represented. Of course, not talking of you, Senator Evan, but just from the local level.
This is to DMV moves. And we also figured a little bit that a few of you in Alexandria have a few other things to be doing the next few months. So
You're slightly, attention is slightly elsewhere at the moment.
Let me just say, listening in, that if we do anything that Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church City doesn't, I'm not going to do anything y'all don't want. I think the reason I'm on there is because I'm a conferee on the budget, and that's the main reason. And we worked hard to get this money, in this immediate time frame. And I think Clark wanted the people who could actually, not to sound boastful, people can actually perform once there are recommendations. So whatever you guys want in terms of the future for transit in any of those jurisdictions, nobody in Fairfax is going to try to limit your dreams. Okay.
Well, you earned it. You personally earned it 4 times over. I mean, you did a ton of work, so not in any way trying to.
And maybe to put a fine point on it, to build on what Delegate Sickles was saying, I think it's important for committees like this to really work towards building a consensus regionally, and I think that should be our goal. I think we can do it. But I think it's also really important that we have these real conversations about issues that are important to our jurisdictions. You know, do we include paratransit or not? You know, I think those are going to be the things that we really have to figure out. And I think through this joint committee and others, we can.
I think we're in consensus.
Other comments? All right, Ms. Tice, should we keep going?
I think we can.
Okay.
So what I want to do is I want to queue up just to go 2 more slides. And this is really, I'll be handing this off to Xavier, but I want to get a little bit of back and context to all of you. This is actually an effort that we started before we knew there was going to be this bigger conversation. And the amazing thing about the scope of this work lends itself to feed in some important data points as we talk with the DMV moves or with the SJ28. So what this is, and I said Xavier's going to dive into it, is really looking at what are the plans, the strategies, and the outlook that our local bus providers have been already working on, and how we can look at them holistically. So Xavier's going to walk through this, and there's, yes, even some very preliminary with lots of red, back of the envelope, don't quote anything, but just to sort of get a sense of this is everybody but WMATA and VRE. So these are our other bus providers that are very important. So go for it, Xavier.
Thank you. So this is the regional bus analysis, as Kate mentioned. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what this is, because those that have heard about this haven't heard about it for a while. So essentially, this is for the 6 Virginia bus providers that must provide, the focus on the 6 Virginia bus providers that must provide transit strategic plans. This is a requirement from the Commonwealth, for the RPT, for transit agencies that are Virginia agencies. So this is everyone except WMATA, basically. You can see in the graphic on the right of the slide, who is included in that universe. So it's ART, Q, Dash, Loudoun County, Fairfax Connector, and OmniRide, our partners to the south. There is currently no strategic planning resource at a regional level in this region. Each of these TSPs covers the agency themselves. There's nothing really that brings them together, and that's what the purpose of this really was to do, is to, you know, connect all these little agencies together into one bigger picture, raise that macro view. It focuses across jurisdictions and service areas. A lot of services stop at their own boundaries. This is something that's a little bit more across the region, and it looks at things like, you know, are there potential routes that might be the future of Route 7, for example, things that cross boundaries, cross service areas. And then we also looked at opportunities for regional collaborations and efficiencies, just to see where there are opportunities to perhaps share infrastructure or share resources in ways that benefit transit in the region. And it's worth also pointing out that this is a 10-year outlook. TSPs, as according to the guidance that these agencies must follow, also have 10-year outlooks. And so our process has that same kind of outlook. Next slide, please. So there are 2 main, I'm splitting the focus of this study and TSPs in general in 2 main parts. First is like, what is the study looks at what exists or what is planned. So there's a meta-analysis of the TSPs is the first part of this. We won't go too much into that, but essentially that requirement from the General Assembly to create TSPs, and most of these actually have been done fairly recently, the most recent version. We're basically looking at what sort of themes or commonalities that are pulled all together in terms of like, what are the existing bus services, what are the planned changes, what are the strategies, bring that all together in one document so you can get an understanding of regional transit through one chapter of this whole study. The other part of that is the financial needs. So the projected short-term, long-term capital and operating needs. And I'll talk about that a lot more at the end of this presentation, is the main point of this tonight. But that is what's called the TSPs, and it's summarized in the what exists. Next slide, please. And the other part of that is considers the future and the unknown. So we looked at things like current and planned services, where there are service gaps, both by time of day and geography. And then considering service gaps, where there are opportunities for shorter term new transit corridors, perhaps, or longer term, perhaps like high capacity corridors, BRT maybe, and then opportunities for bus across jurisdictional bus, for bus across jurisdictions. And then finally, considering space and money constraints, are there opportunities to share infrastructure? So maintenance, storage facilities, fueling options, etc. And especially considering zero emission bus, where there are opportunities to share charging infrastructure and all that kind of thing that MTC's been supporting for a couple of years now. So there's a lot involved in this study and a lot involved in TSPs. Tonight, we are really just going to focus on some of the preliminary stuff. Next slide. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of everything except financial is on this slide, basically. There are 5 major deliverables. They're on the left there. You're going to hear more about these in a couple of weeks at the June Commission meeting. So I won't talk about those too much. The map on the right there is, I think, one of the useful things that came out of this, particularly useful things, I should say, where it shows where there might be more geographic gaps or level of service gaps. So level of service gaps is where there is transit service right now or bus service right now, but perhaps not enough bus service given the populations that are there. And then the timeline, as I said, we're going to present this in the June Commission meeting and ask the Commission for acceptance of this study in the July Commission meeting. So that's a lot of overview of everything except the financial piece. Very quick, but the meaty part is the part that's going to come in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to start with the operating. I cut this through operating, capital, and then I'm going to bring it all together to show you the big picture. So first, looking at the operating costs and bus service, these are intrinsically tied. The more bus service you put out there, the more the cost is going to be. It makes sense. They are closely tied, but it's there's more to operating costs than just the amount of service because there are other factors that can increase bus costs year over year. But they are very closely tied, as the graph on the left indicates. The dotted line is operating cost, and the green line is revenue hours, and they both increase at a very similar rate, which is what you kind of hope. As you put more bus, the costs are very closely associated with bus service. The costs increase at a fairly reliable rate as well. It makes it predictable, which is useful when thinking about in the future. It's about a 4% increase a year, which again, it's fairly it's fairly similar increase year over year. And while it's largely increased by revenue hours, it's also worthy to point out that we're expecting an increase of about just under 40% increase in bus service over those 10 years. So while you're increasing how much operating costs there is going to be in the region, it's not to get the same amount of bus service today. The transit agencies who are in Northern Virginia are anticipating increasing bus service about 3 or 4% a year, every year for the next 10 years.
If I could just add, so just as a reminder, this is what the individual transit systems and their plans that have been through all your boards this is what they're anticipating. So all we're doing is bringing this up. So it's not that NBTC is saying this or we're generating, this is basically from all the plans, the strategic plans that each of your transit systems, bus systems have put together. This is how you bring it together.
Including going electric.
It's whatever's baked into your plan already.
And I'll be touching on that more in a moment. Yeah, I'll be touching on that more in a moment.
Basically, you're an aggregator.
Yes, we're trying to look at when you bring it all together, which is why the first part that said when you bring it all together, where are we missing serving people? And then when you bring it all together, how much did it cost? And so, and that's, again, these are super initial, but just to give you guys a sense of what we're talking about.
And it's also, to put it simply, basically, we basically did a stapling exercise. We basically just got the numbers and stapled them together and made sure that they all added up and the math is right. So like the actual process, while it sounds simple, that's kind of like, to me, the beauty, like relatively simple. It's the kind of the beauty of it is that like, it's easier to understand. Like we're just getting the numbers from TSPs, find the same fiscal years and add them up. And that's how you get these numbers that I'm showing you. And so conceptually, I think it's a fairly straightforward thing to understand how these things have been put together, which makes it easier to explain how we got these numbers. And so there's doing some talk about, the costs and where the revenues come from. As part of the TSPs, transit agencies have to have an estimate of where the money is going to come from to pay for these things. These are supposed to be constrained. And so every cost in these TSPs has an estimate of where money is coming from. I do want to caution that when you're looking 10 years in the future, these are educated best guesses. 10 years is a long time in these kinds of things. And so this is where agencies think money is coming from. where things turn out coming from can always vary a little bit year over year, especially when you don't know what's coming 10 years in the future. So just want to put that caution out there. This is just what is provided in the TSPs from transit agencies. So based on what they are expecting or hoping, however you want to look at it, this split is how the money, they're expecting money to come from different regions. Belly?
Very cool. Counterpart.
I
mean, it's just interesting. We've got all this analysis and it all stops right there, right?
I mean, I'm sure we've got partners in this. It's I don't think there's an MTC equivalent aggregating this. So well, I mean, it's Washington, the Suburban Transportation Commission, but I don't think it's the same.
Can you define regional toll? What
Yes.
how is it?
Yeah, so the regional toll money is actually a combination of mostly the regional stuff, mostly MBTA funds. For this case, it'll be 30% funds. And the toll money is mostly like commuter choice money. And in this case, because toll is kind of like a regional kind of spot, they've been combined together. And it was, yeah, that's essentially all it is for the regional toll. So some of that stuff is based on what's past performance, and some of the stuff is what's expected based on what they are planning to submit for. But as people know, possibly know, the commuter choice money, just because you're submitting for something doesn't mean you're going to get it. So again, this is educated best guess for a lot of this stuff.
Done by the jurisdictions.
Done by the jurisdictions. We're just like showing the map. Well, adding it up, but we did the map. Next slide, please. So this is the capital one. This one is has a lot more caveats to it. And this is because capital in itself by nature is very lumpy and very hard to predict the further out you get. So these numbers here are actually only showing 5 years of data. The previous slide showed 10, because again, operating is a little bit easier to predict over time. You could see the lines, it was fairly even, an average 4%, not a lot of variation year over year. Capital is a way different animal. So we only show 5 years of data here. And what we have here on the left is the types of investments we're expecting with capital. And on the right are, again, the expected, anticipated, hoped for revenue sources. The major capital projects on the left that we had the question about electric infrastructure, that is the major capital stuff is made of two pieces primarily, BRT, which Fairfax and Alexandria have some decent projects coming. And then electric infrastructure is the other part of that. That's the major capital stuff. And so you can see it's a large part of the pie. But the other stuff, fleet vehicles, that's a fairly easy one for transients to predict. There's a useful life of transit vehicles, and so it's a little bit more easy for them to predict how that's going to change with time. But outside of that, a lot of the other stuff can vary a lot. And the closer you get to expenditure, the easier it is to predict what you're going to need. So we have 5 years now, and this graph here, we in our full report, we're going to have all 10 years, but as you go further out, you lose your understanding of like your confidence in what's actually going to come and your understanding of what you might need. So we're only showing 5 because that's where the most confidence is in these numbers. And I will take, if people have questions about any of these things, I can take them as well. But this is just to give you a picture of where the money is expected to go and where it's expected to come from. Next slide, please. So this is putting it all together. Now, while operating those 10 years, I only show 5 years again because that's really what we're using for capital. So over the next 5 years, this is what the 6 local bus agencies that operate in Northern Virginia are anticipating. This is not including any costs that are associated with WMATA. This is just the 6 local bus agencies. That does include OmniRide, but it's just those bus agencies. They're anticipating over the next 5 years, their service costing $1.4 billion. And each of them, I'll also emphasize that the dollars are all year of expenditure. So, you know, there's some rough math and adding that all together. Capital costs 1.6, which makes a roundish kind of number of about $3 billion over the next 5 years for operating and capital for just those 6 bus systems. And that is the overview. The sources are most, like I said, it all came from transit agencies, in some cases jurisdictions where those things are split out. But it all comes from existing documents, TSPs, transit strategic plans, CIPs, capital investment plans, and in some cases, interviews with agency staff. All figures are year of expenditure and include the 6 agencies I pointed out earlier.
Xavier, thank you. Very, very good slides. Excellent data, I think, for helpful.
So that begs the question, what's that shift for? Is that a delayed COVID reaction? Yeah, I'm wondering why.
So that's, remember how I talked about how capital is lumpy?
Yeah,
That's one
you
of the
did.
lumps, essentially. So you can see that dark green down the bottom is fairly straight, that's operating.
Yeah.
Capital varies a lot year over year, depending on like how projects roll out.
Yeah.
So it's always gonna look lumpy.
It's just interesting, doesn't, you might think with a lot of jurisdictions it would even out because the lumps wouldn't all be the same, but maybe they are. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of money being spent in some really great bus stuff over the next few years, and so we're actually seeing a lot of investment there. That dip is just preparing for another rise the next year, so it's just capital's lumpy.
Supervisor Walkinshaw.
I think it's slide 17, maybe. It's a map with the dots. Can you explain again the difference between the geographic gap and the level of service gap?
Yeah, so geographic gap is primarily a place that doesn't have bus service, and a level service gap has bus service, but maybe not enough bus service. So like a bus every hour, where it might be counting as level service gap because you might need a bus every 30 minutes, for example. But and these are aggregated. That's why like some of they're like hexagons. We actually have a version of this for like different time periods. This is just a demonstrator. There's going to be more about this in the actual report. This is just to show the type of analysis. And this is actually one of my favorite types of graphics from the analysis, because I thought this was particularly effective at showing the different types of gaps we have in our region.
And could you talk about what it means to have a gap?
Yeah, so
Zero car household?
yeah, so we actually look at primarily population, but we also look at a variety of different things. Look at zero income households. We looked at areas with people with disabilities. We looked at non-white populations, a whole variety of different types of populations. But a lot of the heavy part of the analysis was focusing on population and job density.
Mr. Gary.
So while we're on this slide, when you talk about the Northern Virginia priority transit corridors, I thought we kind of already had those in mind. Are we just re-emphasizing them, or what exactly will be?
So the priority transit corridors are areas where we might have corridors identified, but perhaps need additional investment. So they might need to be like higher frequency service corridors, or perhaps might need to be upgraded to BRT or some other kind of express type service.
Okay.
There are, in some cases, areas that there might be gaps between different regions, and we actually have some of those that are going to be included in our final study. Those, as you unsurprisingly, tend to be more in the other suburb kind of areas. So perhaps moving from like Prince William County to like Loudoun or Fairfax. Those are some of the areas where we don't have as much right now. And as we look at future needs, there might be some more opportunities there. But a lot of the higher priority stuff is where there's existing service that we probably should consider higher quality service.
Yes, Mr. Schneider.
How are we building in the Route 70? That's all we assume. Using green span, known, this is a known unknown, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, how is it? I know because that we're gonna have actually a conversation about the strategic plan for Route 7 in an upcoming meeting, but in this treatment, how is that?
Done my research. Like we did a couple of prep meetings for this, and I had a look to see if any of the TSPs mention it. One of them does, Fairfax County, which you would hope it would at least mention it. They don't specifically say what service they'll be providing or what capital they do. They did say that they're anticipating more. Again, the construction is far enough out that they don't have the confidence to include the estimates. This is why 10 years for capital is so hard for agencies to do, because they know this is coming. You're right, absolutely. This is a known unknown, but it's so far out that they can't put that kind of number with any confidence in their TSP. And that's one of the challenges of these things. When you're that far out, like even past 5 years, the numbers are just so up in the air. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So they have got it in there and saying they're working with MPTC. They include us by name. They know we're working on this. They're working on this. We're all working together. But they don't have any numbers associated with it in terms of like operating or capital.
and the WMATA Better Bus Network has it in it. So that's, you're right, there's an overlay that occurs when we
There
put.
may be an asterisk here
Mhm.
or something.
Okay.
It could be
So no one
relegated.
actually
It could be
says.
relegated to an asterisk, but maybe that's what I.
This is a snapshot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is, again, when we're talking about how we're looking with SJ 28, DMV moves, the idea is we've got WMATA doing stuff, we've got VRE doing stuff. This is to capture the others. So all that layering, Route 7 is a perfect example. We've got it mentioned, but we've got, it's actually in the Better Bus Network. We already knew that with WMATA. So regardless who's operating it, it's actually being counted. And so the hope was to catch things that are not currently in the WMATA Better Bus Network. So
You may want to cross-track that. or
yeah,
something.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay.
And to be extra explicit about Better Bus, we work very closely with the Better Bus team. One of the Better Bus WMATA project managers was representing WMATA on our technical advisory committee, and it's actually the same consulting team working on both projects.
Yes.
So the same consultants did this work as the WMATA Better Bus work. So there's a lot of talking to each other and awareness. They are different projects in terms of scope and year of when it happens. Better Bus is right now. This is looking 10 years in the future. Who's involved? This includes, for example, Loudon. Better Bus doesn't. So there's some differences that make these different products, but we are working in concert and making sure we're looking at each other's things and using the same team in this case. Coincidentally, it just happened to be the best team in both cases, but there's a lot of coordination going on. So we are aware of them and they are aware of us.
And the Better Bus team will be at the next joint committee meeting to present.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Xavier? Thank you very much. Excellent. Next, I believe we do every year, the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. So anyway, who's Adam? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is pretty straightforward, especially compared to the first two items. So as you said, this is something, of course, that we do every year. So a couple quick slides as a reminder of what this is, why we do it, and our planned approach for 2024. So this is our seventh iteration coming up of this document. This is something that state code has required since 2018. A few things that we have to do every year. Things like strategies to reduce the growth in costs and improve efficiency in operations, the use of capital funds from Virginia, and then some NTD data, so that's the National Transit Database data as far as safety, reliability, ridership, and financial performance data. Of course, last year, we also had a concurrent report that we were working on at the same time, the Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group. So that really informed a lot of what we put together by way of recommendations to not just Metro, but to lots of regional stakeholders back in the fall. And as a reminder on the next slide, these were our near-term priorities from December. And as Kate mentioned at the start of the meeting, there's a lot to celebrate here. There's a lot just this week that kind of got over the line as far as not having to deal with for the next 2 years, the 3% cap and operating growth costs. There's also, of course, additional state aid from the state to match local funding for Metro in the budget for the next. So our first two items here, we can put a nice big check mark, at least at this point, next to them. Beyond that, we did also talk a lot in the report from last year about that push toward this long-term dedicated funding. Lots of things happening in that space. So I think really for 2024, what we're looking at as far as an approach for this document is to kind of double down on those efforts and really focus our staff intentions in that direction. Lastly here, number 4 about federal workers. When Randy was at the commission back in April, he did note that year over year, there was a 33% increase in federal tax. So even though that's not something that MBTC is responsible for, something that we advocated for, we are seeing some progress in that as well. So lots of good things happening.
Can I actually add to that? Because the discussions with OMB continue about creative ways that the federal agencies in the national capital area can help support transit in general. And I will say they're creative, but they're inconclusive right now, but the doors are still open to try to capture back the lost revenues that all of our systems got because of the reduction in the transit benefits. And also anecdotally, as Adam's mentioned, a number of federal agencies are getting pulled back. I was just talking to a colleague who works at IRS, and they're going back to 4 days a week. So there's a lot more movement to more in office by federal, and we're seeing, I know with BRE, seeing it with the ridership, and WMATA is as well. But I did want to say the OMB conversations continue, and actually, they have a lot of interest in finding a solution. They're just trying to find a solution that works legally within the constraints that the federal agencies have. So we're going to keep that spot on there. So
We'll jump to the next slide here for the mid to long-term recommendations from this past year's report. I think our approach here to kind of what we're looking to get input from this committee and really have a sense of what things we want to carry forward, what things we want to tweak a little bit. But I think a lot of these things are either happening or have happened in the case of this first one here with raising fares for rail and bus this year in the FY25 budget. But again, really just looking to advance some of these things that we've really had on the docket for the last couple of years that we're making some progress on. But again, all focused really toward number 7 there at the bottom, which is getting that long-term dedicated sustainable funding. So on the next slide here, again, just talking about our approach for this year with getting some input from this committee, seeing what questions you might have tonight as we get started on this report. And yeah, looking to plug into SJ28 to the DMV Moves initiative. But again, this report, I think, really gives the committee here and the commission a way to double down on the message that we want to convey as part of these conversations that are taking place. So again, quick overview, tee up for this year's report, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Adam. Yeah, I agree. This is an opportunity to amplify some of the issues, some of the points that I think are going to be made or need to be made as part of the long-term funding discussions. It's the only thing, and this is just more for my colleagues, I would want to make sure everybody understands on slide 23 with item number 1, certainly the rebaselining is super important for transit, but for local folks, make sure you work with your local funding budget people on the assumptions that go in, because super grateful that the state is putting money in, but we locals have to match every dollar. So rebaselining is great for transit, but it does mean more of an outlay at the local level and the state level for that. So it continues to be a challenge on our budgets. Other issues, Mr. Dufresne?
I guess I'm really glad you mentioned, Kate, and you brought it up, Adam, the federal piece. And I know that Mr. Mercer is also focused on that. I just not necessarily personally volunteering, but if you mindful of the OMB meetings I've had that have been successful and the ones that have been less successful, but I do feel as though we should not let grass grow on hammering, like every creative way and every as often as, without like belaboring, they just have to keep answering. And if it's not just OMB, is there a friend at Department of Energy? Is there ways that we can just keep working on this, because it seems super important. And then the other thought is the language that I think I saw in the budget that was sent around mentioned the other jurisdictions, the St. Louis, I think Philadelphia, it's a couple of others.
Benchmark.
I would just imagine that is like a big meat and potatoes piece of next year's report. I've been most impressed at is every year the report looks sufficiently different that if I had to do an annual report, it would look a lot the same. So I just feel like that might be a place you might look for a lot of but you're ahead of it. So thanks.
Supervisor Walker-Charles.
So I'm trying to look at the recommendations and the priorities and distinguish between those things that are priorities that make this list versus just kind of our general legislative funding priorities. There does seem to be some overlap here. Like some of these are, and I know I'm kind of a broken record on this, but the thing that needs to be rebaselined is PREA. that is worth about half of what it was when it was instituted. And, you know, when I mention it to Randy, you know, he focuses on it's not operating and it's capital and our big challenges is operating. But just the thing in terms of dealing with the federal government, it's your best, like you're not going to get very difficult to get dedicated operating, but there is a chance to make an argument that the PREA funding is worth half of what it was in 2009 and it should be rebaselined. Pick a number, inflation, Metro's costs, and I just think we should elevate that, and whether that makes sense for, I'm trying to suss out a kind of legislative or on these priorities, but I think it's really important that we start talking more
Absolutely.
about that. So if it fits here, I would say that, you know, I think I probably said this last year too. I've never quite understood, and maybe it's, we got to say it, the jurisdiction's ability to pay. We all, in all of these efforts, are conceding that we have much more ability to pay than we to date have had the political will to exercise. Metro concedes that when they say there needs to be dedicated regional funding. I don't see how arbitrators will be moved by that, because all three compact jurisdictions have unlimited taxing authority, the Constitution of the United States. There is no question about their ability to pay. Metro's fiscal condition maybe is different. So, you know, this is maybe a WMATA board decision. To me, it would be more compelling to require the arbitration to consider Metro's fiscal condition and leave out the jurisdiction's ability to pay, because it's just not credible that we don't have the ability to pay. We do. We have an entire effort to outline that we do have the ability to pay and should exercise the political will to do it. So those would be my two thoughts for consideration.
Thank you very much, James. Other suggestions, questions?
Oh, I just want to add one level setting is that because there was a fare increase in fiscal 25, we're not going to carry forward another fare increase recommendation, but that's at least the staff kind of idea at this moment. I don't think, we don't expect that Metro will either in 26, but there certainly can be language about, you know, increasing fare box recovery and, you know, as there are efforts to help mitigate fare evasion and things like that. But I do just want to just level set that recommendation sort of is checked and may come up in the future, but perhaps not exactly for the next report in the exact same way it was written.
That's helpful. I do have just a couple of quick questions. The rainy day fund at Metro, is there any discussion about the scale of that at this point and the timing? Because that could be a pretty big financial lift.
Absolutely. So I think Mr. Letourneau has indicated that for finance chair of the board, I think
Still
conversations to come, I think might be the answer at this time.
You need the sun to be shining when you establish the rainy day. Not during the storm.
Yeah.
I think some of his comments at the last board meeting were about just getting the concept out there for discussion.
Okay.
Now is the time.
Great. I guess my other, and I haven't been writing all this down. You folks have, but I would want to make sure that we're not missing something in these priorities that we've been talking about in the context of long-term funding. So if someone could crosswalk that just to make sure we're consistent, we can see it. And I realize this is a different process, but the audience is pretty much going to be the same.
We have the opportunity. We're starting this conversation. So there may be some aha moments that come in the deliberations with these other efforts that find their way into this report.
And the timing on this, how much December? Okay, so we do have some time over just during the coming months. That's great. Okay, wonderful. Any other comments, questions? All right. Thank you very much, Adam. Appreciate that. And thank you, Kate, team. And this is, I think, a lot of good stuff, a lot of good work going on. Any additional items for the day? Is it committee
Just one
meetings?
thing which maybe,
Yes.
hey, did you send out the papers that we got, you got after the fact at the WMATA COG meeting with the list of the task force you were asking for? Did you?
She's gonna give.
So, yeah.
You're gonna send it to everybody?
Oh, yeah, well, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's,
Everybody should.
yeah,
That-
also, especially if I can get it directly from their website, but yeah, otherwise I do have something I could scan. Yep, I'll make sure that gets out to both committee members.
Great. And when does the COG committee meet?
So the task
Task
force
force.
has been scheduled for Monday, June 10th.
Okay.
Here in Arlington. And so,
Meeting so far scheduled?
so far,
Because go ahead.
Yeah, I was
Sorry.
just saying, so I was talking a little bit about that. So we don't have a seat, but we probably will at least welcome people to the room. They might tell us to leave our room afterwards, but anyway, we can at least welcome it. And if there's some message or anything that, this group would like us to kind of convey, that would be, I mean, we're not gonna do it, I won't do a diatribe, and we won't, but there might be a few comments that we might wanna,
Couple of seats to plant.
well, yeah, a couple seats to plant. Yeah. So anyway, just throwing that out to the group, so let us know. Matt and I are all ears.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I just asking about that because the joint committee, we're meeting again on July 11th. So I would, as things kind of develop between that and SJ 28, that our schedule might need to be a little flexible. It wouldn't surprise me if we might need a pop-up meeting or two at some point along the way, because there's a lot of stuff.
It's actually a really good thought, as we really get into this, that we're sort of prepared to kind of come together. Maybe they're virtual or something. Yeah.
yeah, we do have a little bit of flexibility with virtual, but not a ton. We can potentially alternate, but I know we were thinking, want to make sure, or there's
Same.
only so many slots we can
Yeah,
have.
I think at least
for
for the
the
WMATA
open
committee,
meetings.
we wanted to say one virtual for the fall, but we have one left, so sort of however we choose to use it.
All right. Any more items for the joint committee? Okay, then we are adjourned as of 7:32.
Good timing.
Thanks, everybody.
You get me.